Washington can be one of college football's biggest risers in 2025.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And just a quick reminder to all you everydayers out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever that may be, please make sure you click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well. And if you're on the audio on this side of things, please leave us a 5-star review, as it not only does it help the channel out a lot, but fall camp starts next week, and we are so amped to get back out on the field, start talking to some players, some coaches, basketball. We got some basketball stuff next week too. So make sure you subscribe for all the latest updates in the world of UW athletics. Lars, on today's show, we are going to be talking about some early targets that are starting to emerge for Washington in the 2027 class. We're also going to spend some time on some June enrollees that maybe we not necessarily overlooked, but need to give some love to ahead of fall camp opening. But after Jedd Fisch took the stage yesterday, one thing stood out to both you and I, and it's, you know, we both believe that Washington is going to be one of the nation's biggest risers this season. And one of the biggest reasons why is just the fact that we saw Washington have a normal offseason.
Yeah, I mean, there's continuity. You didn't.
Yeah.
All the transfers, the majority of the transfers that you came in, were coming in prior to spring camp, so you don't have this big exodus, which you had last spring of, hey, by the way, half your starting offensive line, a lot of your other starters are coming in the spring period, which ironically enough, Jedd is a part of, but I think that's for a different discussion for a different day.
Yeah, that's
But with that being, exactly. But with that being said, it's the continuity that Jedd's talking about, where they're able to bond together, and it's not like, hey, let's have a meet and greet. It's no, hey, remember this guy that you met in January? Now we're even closer in June, July. Now by the time you get down to August, there's not a chemistry question. There's not a familiarity uncertainty where, oh, what is this guy going to do when this happens, or on the field, and there's no longer that hurdle. There's no longer that speed bump, if you will, with the chemistry, on either side of the ball, honestly.
So you make a great point. I think one thing there, you could have phrased it a little bit better. And that's my opinion, where it's when you say, hey, remember this guy you met in January? No, it's, hey, now we've been hanging out together for the better part of 8 months, I think is probably the best way to phrase it, because especially in the trenches, when you look at the offensive line, where I think that's the biggest thing that we need to highlight right now is you and I look at the offensive line and we don't think the starting five is set by any measure, where I think that Paki Finau is going to end up being the starter at left guard, but we know that true freshman John Mills is going to push him. But either way, we know that both those guys have chemistry with the unit as a whole. You and I don't know what the right guard situation is going to look like. Will Champ Talialia end up winning that starting job, another true freshman? Or will it go to one of Zach Henning or Gieran Hatchett, some of the upperclassmen? We don't know, but we've seen all those guys function with Landon Hatchett at center, with both Maximus McCree and Drew Azzopardi at right tackle. We have seen that this lineup, and especially just, again, on the offensive line as a whole, but around the entire roster. We saw all this during spring practice, and that is such an important factor to overlook. And when Jedd Fisch talks about having chemistry, all those other things, I know he went on the Big Ten Network and talked about all the guys like having a sleepover on the field or whatever it was they were doing. Are those little things in the grand scheme of football? Yeah, absolutely. But are those also things that this team really didn't have a chance to do at any point last season? Because as you said, half the roster didn't know each other. Yeah, and that's something that's really important.
Yeah, it might sound corny that, oh, hey, the whole team was having a sleepover at Husky Stadium. Sure. And it's like, but that's the fun, unique, you don't do that with people that you just met. It's like a senior graduating class. It's not a, hey, let's kind of do a, hangout session, a movie night, whatever you want to call it. I do wonder, how long did they actually make it the entire night, because I have to imagine that would get a little cold and there is no.
Hey, man, I saw those photos of the UW football Instagram, Twitter, I'll put out on social media, and they're playing spike ball and everything. I miss spike ball. Spike ball is fantastic, but it's all those little things like that. And I'm sure some people are saying, well, how does this relate to the season? These are things where you look at some of the mental mistakes that this team made last season, especially early on, committing whatever it was, 14, 15 penalties against Washington State, committing key penalties against Rutgers, not looking very cohesive as a unit at various points of time throughout the season. Were there coaching issues that also, contributed to those? Yes. Were there injuries that played into that? Yes. But when you look at what it's like to have an entire offseason of just pure normalcy and building that bond and going through workouts together in the winter, in spring practice, in the summer, those are things that once you get out to into fall camp for, those aren't things that we're going to see. Where I remember last year during spring practice, Jedd Fisch called those first 2 or 3 days of learning, because guys didn't know the playbook. Guys didn't know what was going on. And even as you get into fall camp and the start of the season, those were still issues that you can have. And we saw those pop up at various points early on in the season. And as I look to 2025 with Ron Williams taking over a quarterback, which is, where we certainly need to move this conversation, those are things that are not going to happen this fall. And while, it might still be tough to overcome a massively talented coming off a national championship roster in Ohio State and taking some of the long road trips that you need to in this conference, there's no doubt in my mind that this team is going to take a step forward. And most importantly, in that regard, with Devon Williams at the helm, win road games, which is something we didn't see last year either.
And what's one of the key pieces on the road? Communication between the O-line and the quarterback. And I think having Michael Switzer as an analyst / assistant, whatever you want to call him, last season, where clearly he did take more of a holistic approach. It was, let me examine the entire offense, not just the offensive line. I think that is going to be paramount to Washington rising in this fall, because there's already that understanding between Switzer and Damon. Switzer, the offensive line, Damon and his guys coming back, where everybody that, aside from Gearin, I think, everybody else came back, and Carver Willis. But Carver being a veteran, spoke highly of Damon when he's like, hey, Avery's pretty fast. Damon's, I think, right? I'm not saying he's even faster, but, there's already that understanding there where there's not oh, wait, I didn't know Damon would do this. Like, everybody already knows now inside the building who Damon is. This fall is when everybody outside the building truly gets to understand it. And we're seeing it now where, like you mentioned, PFF, Joel Klatt, everybody praising Damon. It's like, there are some educated folks out there who already knew. And then if they listen to us, they've known since January and before then. But I think even with every single day where, to use another word that Jedd used last year, it was the foundation. Well, everybody is now learning how Washington is building on that foundation. This isn't a foundational year anymore. That was already laid. That is already set. Maybe they didn't pay attention to it last year, but I think now people are starting to realize, oh, wow, actually, Jedd's doing more than just hyping his team up. Like, there's actual substance behind what Jedd is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a big part of this where, you're seeing, you mentioned the Pro Football Focus thing, where Pro Football Focus said that Damon Williams is one of the most likely players to break out this fall. And that's all great. And yeah, it is all stuff we've been talking about, but it all plays back into this chemistry factor where that's one of the reasons it was so important for him to get snaps last season. But it's also something where, you look at Jonah Coleman, Denzel Boston, the guys that are returning, plus, another new guy who's coming into this offense in Omari Evans, plus the other returners at running back, Adam Muhammad, Jordan Washington, guys that are going to be taking on bigger roles at receiver, whether it be Rasheed Williams, Kevin Green Jr., Audric Harris, or some of these true freshmen that get worked in. That chemistry is still there because we saw it all winter and through the spring. And those are things that, as Washington, in both of our opinions, does take a step forward this season, are going to be things that at the end of the day, you can look back on and say, oh yeah, that's something that, is probably still going to go underrated, but we wanted to make sure it got highlighted because at the end of the day, again, those things are going to matter. And as Jedd Fisch continues to build his program, I'd bet you anything that at some point in, middle of October, if this team's, let's just say they're 5-1 at a certain point in time, Jedd Fisch is going to say, yeah, big kudos to us having a normal offseason and getting to, build out the, as you like to say, the foundation of everything that was going on here. We did that all winter and all spring, and that's what's helped get us to this point. And Lars, these guys haven't been around to build the foundation, but there are some freshmen that we think might be able to make an impact this fall. And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. We just talked about why Washington is going to be such a nice riser this year. That 7.5 line at FanDuel, we absolutely love where that's sitting right now. And if you slam that over, we both feel Washington could be in that 8-4, 9-3 department with the way the schedule sets up and those All-Americans and Jonah, Coleman, Denzel, Boston leading the charge. Plus guys like Damon Williams, Takario Davis. Again, the way this schedule sets up for Washington at home specifically, yeah, we love where the Huskies can be by the end of 2025. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Lars, there are only so many freshmen that are able to enroll in time for winter workouts and participate in spring practice. And there are a couple of guys who you and I are pretty excited about. One person who, right off the top, for all you everydayers out there, we will not be mentioning Dylan Robinson in this segment because he is honestly the whole reason this exists, where it's, hey, we've talked so much about him. We need to give some love to some of the other guys. And one player who I think might be flying under the radar and friend of the pod, who we don't necessarily know how much he'll end up playing this fall, but could be somebody with where he is physically and just kind of his background, and not just football and in rugby as well, and what he is as a run defender, someone who might be able to make an impact, is outside linebacker Devin Hyde.
The more we think about Devin Hyde, the more it makes sense. He's certainly going to see the field this fall. Do I think it's more than 5 games, 4 or 5 games, depending on the bowl game? No. But I do think he is a guy where if we see him on special teams, or maybe to an extent, given the body type is slightly different, I don't think it'll be exactly the same. But when Jacob Lane came in as a freshman on those speed third down packages, I could see some things like that where as Devin gets his feet wet on special teams, maybe later in the season, certain games, maybe, the Maryland game, the UCLA game, for instance, where I could see him sprinkling in some snaps there. But again, not a guy who I would expect to burn the register by any stretch of the imagination, but a guy who I think we do know does have those instincts, does have certain traits where you can see him using those as a freshman and then building off of that in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is, like, again, these are only guys that are enrolled in June. Like, I think when I think about somebody who might play in those roles, Caleb Smith might be a little bit ahead of him in that regard right now because he did participate in spring practice. But I think he's someone who, again, where he is right now as an edge-setting run defender is something where if we see him just take that step forward during spring practice, he's someone who can find a way to just succeed in some of those roles. And I can see him stand out during camp. And then, early on against the UC Davises and Colorado States of the world, we could definitely see him finding a way onto the field in the second half of some of those games, which is something I'm really curious about because, again, after this Russell Davis injury, you're just going to be looking for players to step up. You talked about Jacob Lane. I think he's someone who has an opportunity to seize a major role with Russell Davis out. I think Isaiah Ward is going to take a step forward this year. I know the coaching staff put some weight on him to try to make him into a much better run defender as well, because that's something that Jedd Fisch talked about last year. And with Deshaun Lynch in the room as well, someone who we know at that size can be a really nice edge setter. It's not something where, like, if he doesn't play at all this fall, I'm not going to be surprised, but we know that Jedd Fisch wants to work in as many of these guys as possible. So in 2026 and beyond, they already have some kind of base of experience at the college level, even if it's not against another Big Ten opponent.
And I think that's why I'll always remember. I agree. Caleb Smith is another guy who probably is ahead of Devin Hyde in that realm to see the field. But I think it all starts on special teams. I think when you go get 2 special teams coaches, Chris Petrelli being the special teams coordinator, and then Greg Perlick from East Carolina, or one of those 2 former Michigan players. Charlotte, thank you. And you look at it and think, okay, well, if you're investing so heavily in the special teams, that means it's for the freshmen, for every player, but especially I think the freshmen, because special teams is an area of the game where, especially in those trench areas where you can play them against a Wazoo, against Colorado State, if you will, UC Davis, or even some of the other Big Ten games down the stretch, as you kind of get them sprinkled in, where if they can handle it on special teams, then you introduce them to some packages on defense. And because again, you're talking about the depth that they have built up, they don't need to play this year. Like you have a need along the defensive line. Don't get me wrong. I don't want that clipped and taken out of context. You obviously do need help along the defensive line, but I don't look at Caleb Smith or Devin Hyde as somebody where, hey, they could be a game changer this season. Down the line, certainly. But that's why you want to get those guys sprinkled in so they have, at least, like you said, their feet wet. And I think most of that's going to come on special teams, and then we'll just kind of see what else they can handle off of that.
No, I think that's fair. And another guy who I posed this question with our insiders the other day, where I've set the over-under for freshmen burning their red shirts this year at 6.5. And I think one of the wild cards that could, end up pushing that over is Donovan Robinson, where this is a guy where you just look at him physically at 6'3", 215, 220 pounds, whatever he's at right now, after just being so productive in Illinois, not just at linebacker and at safety, where he's listed as a safety right now, but if he ends up playing linebacker this season, I won't be shocked, especially with some of the injuries that we've seen at the position where, we don't know what Jacob Manu and Isala are going to look like, both coming off the torn ACLs. So if Donovan does end up just playing a little bit more in the box in a linebacker sort of role, I don't think you or I will be shocked. But it's also something where when you talk about just how athletic he is, where he played wide receiver at the high school level, he was their kick returner at the high school level as well. Just somebody with that level of athleticism, when you talk about someone who, again, with where he is physically, who could be a gunner for you on special teams, he's someone I'm really interested in. And as the pads go on after the first week, where you and I, that's the best example we can give because of just how much they stand out physically. But when you and I were at the for spring ball and we saw John Mills, Jack Schaefer, Champ Talialia, just hanging in so well physically early on in practice, if Donovan Robinson brings that same level of just, oh yeah, that kid doesn't look like a freshman, I'm not going to be shocked.
No, I remember meeting him at the Dogs After Dark, before the Dogs After Dark spring game, and I just look, and I'm like, yep. Like this, when Jedd Fisch talked about getting those Big Ten bodies, those especially coming into the high school ranks, Donovan Robinson is not, Donovan Robinson. I almost confused him with Dylan there for a second. Is one guy you look at.
He's pretty physically ready too.
And that's why I was like, wait, did I get those Robinsons confused again? But no, but you look at Donovan and think, like, that's a guy who made it, especially when he puts on, there may be 5 to 10 pounds of extra, just good weight, good muscle, because he already is going to come in pretty good shape. But I just think, adding just a little bit more muscle will help him. But absolutely a guy where just day one, it's probably going to be more so as the gunner on special teams. And again, kind of why I'm dying on that hill, because I remember similarly Ryland Allen, who came in spring, telling me, hey, like, I already know I'm probably going to play on special teams, and then they'll see kind of, how I progress from there. That just seems to be the line of track. But again, Donovan Robinson hits so well. A high school version of Ezekiel Turner, kind of his long-term projectability where I could maybe see him ending up at. And, man, you can take those hitters anytime. I don't care if you're a freshman or a senior. You want those guys, especially, laying the lumber, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a big part that often does get overlooked where, I think about Tristan Dunn a couple of years ago making a big impact on special teams, and just some other guys in that same realm, where Maurice Himes is another one where we've just seen these guys come in and, it's always unfortunate when it doesn't work out in terms of playing whatever position it is they come in at. But if you're able to make an impact on special teams, especially early, that's always great because that's something that does make an impact for the program in the long run. So those are the two defenders we wanted to talk about. Let's move over to the offensive side, where you and I, before we started, we each picked one guy to talk about. I'll let you go first.
The guy that I feel is criminally slept on in this class, especially on the offensive side, that's Deji Jose, where I remember talking to him when he got the offer from Washington. I want to say back in mid-June, late June, some point, maybe May. At some point, he wasn't an early target, but then you have circled back to him, and he was listed as an athlete originally. Could play on, more so cornerback, wide receiver, but then they ended up kind of saying, you know what, you're going to be a receiver. Man, like, he's got the height, 6'3", 6'2", 6'3", maybe even 6'4", depending, somewhere in that ballpark. But a guy who really can go up on a high point the ball and does have that height to match. So you're not talking about a 5'10" guy who levels up. You're talking about 6'3" who can even level up higher, going against, those Richard Sherman or Ephesian Priceock long cornerbacks who can actually match up with size. He also has the speed to me that's really intriguing, where you don't just have the height, you have the speed to break away as well. So I think if he's a guy we're talking about going into next spring, and like, hey, look what he did last fall as a freshman, I won't be surprised.
No, I like where you're going with that. The one guy I wanted to talk about is former 4-star recruit Bear Naone. He's someone who I think we both not necessarily inspected him to enroll early because, I like to mention every time he decided to stay in high school and play baseball and try to win a state championship on that side, which I absolutely love. But he's someone who, just with where he is physically, especially as a run blocker, is someone who has the potential to get on the field early. And I look at where Washington sits just in terms of tight end depth right now. It's going to be very hard for him to surpass Quentin Moore, who's one of the better run blockers in the country at the position. We know what Decker DeGraff brings at him as that move tight end, and he spent a lot of time with us this spring telling us about how much he's worked as a run blocker to improve that aspect of his game so we can stay on the field for all 3 downs. And then this coaching staff really likes where Cade Eldridge is as well, the USC transfer. So you already have 3 guys who I don't want to say are entrenched at the position. I think the top 2 might be. But if Barron can come in and prove that he is, already pretty advanced as a run blocker and can pick up the playbook pretty quickly in fall camp, he's someone who, in that same light as Devin Hyde, I don't know if he ends up burning his red shirt just because of where the position is right now. But if he plays in 3, 4, 5, including a bowl games this year, I'm not going to be shocked because he already has that level of physicality down, and just where he is as a receiver too. I really think that he's someone who you can find a way to make a 3-down tight end by year 2. Truly, he has that level of upside. But those are just a couple of guys we wanted to make sure you keep an eye on from the 2025 class. We're going to fast forward to 2027 with a couple of more targets that are starting to emerge. Lars, the first guy we want to keep an eye on is someone who there's some news surrounding him. That's 4-star linebacker Liufau Loumoli of formerly Eastside Catholic, who's transferred to IMG Academy in Florida. This is something that I don't think comes as a shock to you or I when you look over his offer list. He's got close to 30 offers. He was a top 5 player in the state, according to 247 Sports rankings. And this is someone who we look at what linebacker looks like right now for the position. Obviously, Washington took 2.5, depending on how you feel about Donovan Robinson, who has been spotted, working out with the linebackers and going out to dinner with them, according to Brian Odom's Twitter account and everything. But I look at Liufau Loumoli and where this position could be by the time 27 rolls around, because you're going to be losing Jacob Manu no matter what by the end of the 26 season. Same with X-Ray Alexander. Same with Buda Alukta. So it's something where if you want to take a couple of guys in that class, that's going to be really important. And I think it's going to be a whole lot harder to get him now because he does have a lot of national interest, but he's someone who, being from the state of Washington, I feel like Washington has already developed a solid relationship with him. And he's just become even more of a must-get target because when guys go to IMG like this, when they're one of these big national recruits, if you're able to bring them back, a lot like what happened with Cody Green, that would be considered a big-time win for the program.
I'm glad you mentioned Cody Green's name because that was the one that I wanted to point to first off, is a guy that went from, I believe, he went to Eastside Catholic as well, and then transferred to Modern Day, I believe, as a sophomore, who not as a junior. But another guy who never lost the connection with the staff, especially, again, it doesn't hurt when his older brother, Cody Green, is a walk-on in the program. That doesn't hurt at any time. But I think another thing to keep in mind is UW has also pulled guys from IMG. We're talking about Rain Vinesbright coming from Arizona, went to IMG, and is now coming back to Seattle. So you have the familiarity with the IMG staff. So you're not just saying, oh, he's going to IMG now. Probably that means Florida, Bama, Miami, Georgia, all those schools. The normal ones that you think about when you talk about schools from the South. But I do think Washington is going to be very much in that Cody Green mold where, maybe he ends up committing somewhere else, or first in the process, if you think about that, because he is the 27 recruit. There's still plenty of time to have that decision formally made, but then circle back to Washington. Because like you mentioned, he already has, over 28, 29 offers. And that was the guy to me where I looked at when I was looking at the in-state guys thinking, wow, some of these guys have 10 offers, 8 offers, 5. Yeah. Oh, and then you got 30 offers here. And so I think there was always going to be the case where, that he would end up committing first. But I think this offers Washington a chance to almost hit a reset in a way where we know where we're going to be. We know we're always going to be there. And I think it's going to be a long-term approach. So if he commits to another school first, I wouldn't be worried if I'm a Washington fan.
So I like where you're going with that. I want to talk about another guy who I was going to say is like going to end up at linebacker as well, but who knows where this is somebody I'm really intrigued by. He just did an interview with, I believe it was Blair Angular or Greg Biggins at 247 the other day and named Washington the leader. It's 4-star safety, Isala Aisa Wily-Ava from St. John Bosco High School down in Southern California. And he's someone where I'm sure there are going to be everydayers or just people who follow recruiting and say, Washington's pushing for another safety when they've got 6 defensive backs committed, where obviously, you want to retool the position every year and still add high-end talent, stat classes every single year. But this is a guy that I'm interested in multiple regards, where I think at 6'2", 195, he could end up at linebacker at the next level. He's also a super impressive athlete and set a school record at Bosco with 7 interceptions as a sophomore, which made him a Max Preps All-American last year. But it's one of those things where I just look around the secondary as a whole and just the back end of any Ryan Walters defense and having guys who can fly around and line up at any place and just, get to the football, whether it be with a tackle or getting their hands on it, is a huge win. And a guy who's this highly rated, I'm pretty sure he's still in the top 150 nationally, according to 247 Sports, would be a big win for Washington. And it also just, after taking so many defensive backs in this last class, even if you do want to bring him in and start him off at safety, you still want to make sure you focus on some of the higher end players at that position, just around the secondary in general. And if you only end up taking 3 defensive backs, but it's him and a couple other guys, I'll make sure to mention on the back end, that's going to be a huge win for this class.
It's the old adage of Jedd of you never turn down talent. You might not need about 4, 5, 6 defensive backs again in 27, but you want to at least take 2. And I think you have maybe the one guy that you can say he might be a day one freshman, and then the other guy is a project that you can work in 18 to 24 months down the road. That would probably be kind of how I'd imagine that 27 class would come in at safety, just because, like you mentioned, you're going to have Gavin Day. You're going to have, I think Alex will be a sophomore at that point. Obviously,
Alex McLaughlin. No, he'll be a senior next year.
A senior. That's right. And so you're talking about, you don't need a ton of immediate impact coming in, but you do want at least one coming in, knowing you have Gavin Day and some of the other ones that are going to be waiting in the wings.
Yeah, absolutely. Where another guy who you just need to mention when you talk about the secondary in the 2027 class is Josiah Molden, where I look at, obviously, Elijah Molden's younger brother, but you can just look at the secondary and no matter what, whether he does end up playing outside or inside, where he's just a bigger version of his brother, according to some of the experts who've been able to watch him play and everything. And I look at a guy like that, and no matter what your secondary looks like, you find a room for a player like that, whose older brother, obviously bucked the trend of his dad being an Oregon standout and coming up to Washington. So if you're able to continue that trend, you take that player 11 times out of 10. And then on top of that, when you're stacking that high-end talent, where let's say, like, I don't mean this to offend anybody in the class, where let's say, we're both really high on Jared Jones and on Rajon Duncan. But if Josiah Molden comes in and beats them out as a true freshman, a la Trent McDuffie did with some of those upperclassmen when he enrolled in 2019, nobody's going to be mad about that, because it's just adding another high-end player to the position group. And it's the same with Wily-Ava, where if you're just consistently adding high-end talent, where I know, obviously, they're the ghosts are screaming saying it still matters along the defensive line. One does not, cancel out the other. Like, it's just adding talent wherever possible to every single position. If you're able to do that in the secondary by adding both of these guys, where, again, what Wily-Ava told, I believe it was Greg Biggins, was that Washington is just all out blitzing. It's every single day he's getting a text from Ryan Walters, from Taylor Mays, because they understand how important a player like that can be to their scheme. And they have done a good job of standing out and putting themselves ahead of some big time national offers. And when we look at how recruiting has gone in this class outside of defensive line, Washington has done a really good job of standing out amid some big time offers. So if you're able to continue doing that moving forward, that's a really good sign of what Jedd Fisch and this program is building. When, it's something I remember from his introductory press conference, talking about how he wanted a staff of relentless recruiters, because when you're able to bring in more elite talent, you're able to continue standing out to these top 150, top 100 guys, where I know all of recruiting is a crapshoot. I know, but when you're able to hit on these guys and consistently bring in players that have those higher likelihoods, those higher probabilities of succeeding, that's a good thing for your program.
Absolutely. But also it does in some way help the D-line recruiting, where if I'm a top tier defensive lineman, I know that I have 4 and 5, 4-star after 4-star after 4-star on the back end. that makes me want to play for that school because like, cool, I don't have to always be worried about, oh, I'm like, the guy that's saving grace around that's all the weight is on my shoulders. I don't know what we've almost seen where it's like, hey, once we start to see that secondary talent get restocked, I think it's going to help the deal on recruiting. But to be fair, it is, mutually exclusive from the other, but it does help each other in the long run. And I think, it's why you went out and got Taylor Mays. It's why you also paired him with Ryan Walters and gave John Richardson a promotion. So you're not just saying, hey, now we're going to be Ryan Walters and Taylor Mays, or John Richardson, and Ryan Walters. No, all three of them. Like, that's the whole point, is you're building an infrastructure at Washington to say, no matter who it is, no matter what the, position is, we are always going to be saved back to front and vice versa, except right now you're a little more shaky on the front.
Right, where it's one, and again, that's why we talk so consistently about stacking classes and what that means moving forward. And speaking of stacking classes, one guy that we want to talk about before we get out of here is someone else I'm really interested in. We're talking about stacking classes at receiver. We spent a lot of time on some pass catchers already in this episode. Is 4-star Cedric Sidney from, I believe it's Desert Edge High School down in Arizona. He's someone who also named Washington among the early offers that are standing out for him alongside Arizona State and USC. And Washington, again, with this Jedd Fisch staff, has done a good job going into Arizona and picking out some really talented players from the 24 class, 25 class as well. And I look at where Washington can be with a guy like Cedric Sidney. It's the same thing that I'm talking about at defensive back, where are you going to take 4 or 5 receivers again in 2026, or excuse me, in 2027? No, definitely not. But when you're able to continue stacking that talent, and we look at the receivers that you're able to bring in this 26 class, getting Mason James as your high-end guy, someone like Blaise LaVista, who you wrote about over on Huskies Wire, who spurned offers from USC, from Michigan State, from Nebraska, because he said, no, you're too late, and is getting that big-time interest. Still adding on to that year in and year out creates this lethal offense that Jedd Fisch was able to build at Arizona and can continue carrying it over for no matter who's playing quarterback.
Yeah, it takes away any possible excuse, because if you say, what about injury? We've got 4 or 5 guys lined up behind him. You don't have the depth issue. You talk about the talent. Talent gets better every year. You don't have the gap in talent or cliff that you fall off where you go from Roman Dunze, Jalen Polk to 4 freshmen. And there's a significant gulf there in talent. None of those excuses are kind of come to fruition because Jedd's eliminating every single one. And by the way, it's exactly what you want him to do. You don't want Jedd to have an out or give himself the caveat or benefit of the doubt. He's like, no, you know what? This is a challenge on us as coaches to put as much talent on the roster as possible so we don't have those excuses. And that's what you want to have as a fan and as a player, honestly.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the videos tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you. Again, with training camp on the horizon, we are so excited to get back out there, and we're going to be giving you updates after every single practice, everything that's going on in the world of Husky athletics. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please give us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.